Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of the podcast, The Coldest Murder. If you listen to podcast 1, we have laid out a heinous crime that was committed in 1962 when a 9-year-old girl named Ann Dougherty was murdered and raped in a Catholic church, which happened to be around the corner from my house in Bristol Borough. We laid out the particulars in the first episode of that murder, and now we are going on with the podcast to give it a little more depth on who the suspects may have been, who could have committed this crime, why wasn't this solved, and it has been a cold case for now more than 62 years. I have my cohort Vince Mola with us, and we have Vince. Last time we introduced the possible suspects, and of course, one of the ones that gets the most attention in your brain is that one of the suspects was the priest at St. Mark's Church, who a lot of people thought committed this murder.
Well, I have to say, in some ways, he seems like, at first glance, it seems like an impossibility. It seems like it's written for television. It's written for a podcast. It seems like it's an over-the-top, creation or a red herring. But, given what we now know about priests, proclivities, and how the Catholic Church shielded and ignored and kept things quiet, the idea of a priest being involved in this becomes less crazy and more credible.
And of course, the purpose of this podcast is not to indict anybody, but to just provide as much evidence as we can that you, the listener, can decide what's really up. The police could not solve this case many years ago. And since then, it's been a cold case where nobody's been able to solve it. So the only way that we can delve into it is to give you the particulars and then figure out and then maybe connect. In this day and age where DNA is more sophisticated, at the end of this podcast, we might have a general idea who actually committed this murder, because it's something, as you know, it has affected me personally. It has affected a lot of people in the little town of Bristol Borough where it happened. It's just for review. The murder happened at like 4:30 in the afternoon. I happened to be on my front lawn throwing a football around with my brother. The police chief of Bristol at the time, Vincent Farragalli, was a relative of ours. He called my family and said, get the kids in the house. There might be a murderer on the loose. We just found a murdered little girl in St. Mark's Church. And from that moment on, it has left an indelible impact on my brain, simply for the fact that it has not been solved. And in 1962, if we bring up the Catholic Church was sacrosanct. There wasn't a lot of accusations made by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was almighty and all powerful, and every parishioner in Bristol trusted the Catholic Church and the priests that they were preaching the word of goodness and the word of God. Let me just give you a little perspective on this now. Ann Dougherty, the murdered 9-year-old girl, was in the 5th grade at tiny St. Mark's School, which was connected to St. Mark's Church. There were 2 Catholic churches in Bristol at the time, and it's really funny when I look back at it, and this has a historical connection to it. St. Mark's was the Irish Catholic Church. St. Anne's was the Italian Catholic Church. Now, if you know your history of Catholicism, and you can actually get a really good indication from Godfather 2, but there was a real disparity in the Catholic Irish Church and the Italian Irish Church, and the same dynamic existed in a little town of Bristol Borough. It was very odd when I would decide to go to the Irish Catholic Church because it was closer to my house, and my father was a stickler of me going to Mass, and I didn't feel like walking across the town to go to the town. But when I went into that Irish church, I was considered an alien. I remember getting looks at like, wait, you're not an Irish Catholic. You belong in the other church. It was a very strange dynamic. And if you go back in history, when the Irish were the first to come over, immigrant-wise, and they really started Catholic churches in New York City when they came in at Fire Island and or at Ellis Island. and they really kind of kept out the Italians that wanted to worship. And if you look at a scene in The Godfather where there was the festa scene, where the Italians had the festa and they brought out the Christ statue and people would stuff money in it. The Italians had to hold a lot of their ceremonies outside because they were not permitted to get into the Irish church. That dynamic existed many years later. Now, in 1962, in Bristol Borough. So Carol Ann Dougherty was a product of the Irish Catholic Church, and the Italians were products of St. Anne's Church. Now, Bristol, as Vince knows, he grew up fairly close to Bristol, was a town of a pocket of immigrants, and they had found a town accepting of their various cultures. It was once small enough for all to respectfully blend. We all went to the same schools together. We were a public school oriented town where we went from elementary school to the main high school, which was a high school that included grades 7 through 12. So it was an assimilated town. As much as towns grow up these days that are bigger, that are really pockets of people that stay with their own kind. Bristol was assimilated a little more. There wasn't really the kind of racial problems or the kind of dynamic that you would see in other towns where people stayed away from other people of other cultures. So, for instance, my high school, and I was a public educated kid. I did not go to Catholic school for various reasons within my family. My mother was not a Catholic, and the decision was made that I would go to public school. So I was a public school creation my whole life. I had no experience with St. Mark's Church or St. Mark's School or St. Anne's School and St. Anne's Church. So let's get into what happened that day, Vince. The scene that was left in St. Mark's Church was described as heartbreaking and disturbing as any police officer had ever seen. And I have gone back to see the testimony of Bristol police that were investigating this crime. And I know police are supposed to be above emotions, but this was a 9-year-old girl raped, strangled, murdered, a sock stuffed in her mouth. It couldn't get any more heartbreaking. Carol Ann Dougherty's lifeless body was laid out on the first landing of the stairs that led up to the church's balcony. As depicted by author Michael Capuzzo, who wrote a book about various cold case tragedies titled The Murder Room, light from a stained glass window revealed her blonde mussed and untied hair. The red plastic barrette that had held it in a ponytail was laying nearby on the landing. One of her feet was bare. The shoe was tossed to the side. The sock was stuffed in her mouth, gagging her. Carol's small right arm was wrenched behind her back. Her left hand was straight out, clutching 3 dark hairs, a man's pubic hairs, which she had grabbed during the fatal struggle. She had been forcefully raped. Semen was found at the scene, and the grooves on her neck from the rope that strangled her to death appeared to match the pattern of a cincture, the long rope-like cord that was tied around the waist of a priest's alb, which was the full-length Roman tunic. To Roman Catholics, the cincture was a symbol of the priest's charity, chastity, and purity. Now, that is a vivid scene that I just described, and I hope it didn't upset many people that were listening to this, but those were the elements of the crime as it was revealed and as it was discovered by the Bristol police.
I can't imagine, especially a community that is so entrenched in Catholicism and the power and as you know, that power extended beyond the pews, beyond the pulpit, beyond the 4 walls of that church. It spilled out into the community. And for example, your uncle Ferrangeli, Vincent Ferrangeli, he was a Catholic, presumably.
Yeah, he was. Well, in an investigation, and we'll get into the suspects in a second. But when one of the suspects happens to be a priest, and you're a Catholic police chief, you've got a lot of things that you have to wade through emotionally to get to the truth, while the other side is fighting you off. Now, just for perspective, I was 7, and this was pretty impactful for me that somebody was dead. It was in my age group. I mean, at age 7, you don't really process that. You don't really think of something like that could happen, that somebody would not be on the face of the earth who was frolicking around your hometown, a few days ago. But in Bristol, there was a series of events that shaped me as well. This was the first thing. Several years later, a young boy that I had played Little League baseball with was killed by a train on a high rise. Bristol is a town that a train goes right through it on high rise tracks. We were always told, even though if you cross the train tracks, you can get from one side of the town to the other side very quickly instead of going all the way around. We were specifically told never to cross the high rises because it was a dangerous situation. This friend of mine who had played Little League baseball decided to do it after a game, and he was hit by a train and died. So I'm talking about now 2 deaths that I had to process. And then years later, there was a third death when a friend of mine had actually hung himself on a swing set. So the first one was just flabbergasting to me to believe that this kind of thing can happen. And then I got desensitized towards it, that it became almost a commonplace that young kids could also die. And we weren't expecting that to ever happen. So here's the question now as we get into episode 2. Who raped and murdered Carol Ann Dougherty? Now, through their investigation, Bristol police had lined up 4 major suspects. The following information had been discovered originally by a reporter named J.D. Mullane, who we mentioned in the first podcast. He was the Bucks County Courier Times reporter who in 1992 was permitted by Bristol police to view the case file. This is the first time any reporter had looked at the case file. So in the case file, they listed the possible suspects. The first suspect that was listed was a man named Frank Zucchero. Zucchero was an older handyman in town who had often been seen staggering drunk through the streets of Bristol. And on that particular day, he was seen staggering drunk again on Ratcliffe Street, where St. Mark's Church was, and his body was walking towards the church. So at about the same time of the murder. So obviously, police questioned him. And also the Bucks County DA at the time questioned him. Zucchero confessed to the murder. So the first suspect that they interviewed actually confessed to the murder, and he described in detail how he had raped and strangled Carol Ann. Put this aside now. This is the first suspect drunk on the street where the church was, where the murder happened, who confessed to the crime. Easy peasy, right? Not so fast. Here comes a second suspect. Faragalli, my uncle, the police chief, and alerted my mother, the one who alerted my mother to get the kids in the house, had received an unusual call a couple of days later from a couple named Alfred and Pauline Kalman of nearby Morrisville, PA. Bristol and Morrisville are neighboring towns. In fact, every Thanksgiving, they have the traditional Thanksgiving Day football game, 2 small schools who battle each other. Alfred and Pauline Kalman of Morrisville, PA, told the chief, Faragalli, that they were certain that their own son, Wayne Roach, a 19-year-old kid, had committed the crime. They said they found a notebook in Wayne's jacket pocket with the words Carol Ann Dougherty written in it. Meanwhile, the town's postmaster in Bristol told police that he had seen Roach in Bristol that day at the post office on a street called Beaver Street, which is on the other side of town from the church, the afternoon of the murder. The postmaster said he remembered Roach and said that he had seen scratches on the face of the 19-year-old, which would indicate defensive wounds. Now we have two suspects: the drunken handyman who had confessed to the murder, the 19-year-old who had written elements of her life in a notebook where his parents found and turned him in. There was a third suspect. The third suspect was named William Schrader. Schrader was again a drifter of sorts who had come to Bristol for reasons unknown. Nobody really seemed to know anything about William Schrader. He just ended up in Bristol, and he had found factory work at a place called the Century Tool Company in Croydon, a tiny borough set along the industrial train tracks that bordered Bristol Borough. Schrader had lived on the 300 block of Lincoln Avenue, the street adjacent to St. Mark's Church. His residence was on the street next to the church. In January of 1963, and we're talking a couple of months after the murder, an eyewitness told Bristol police that they had seen Schrader at the church the day of the murder. Schrader denied being in the area that day and denied killing Carol Ann Dougherty, saying he had been at work at the Croydon Tool Company and said there would be no way that he could have committed the crime at that time since he was at work. He said he had punched out of the Croydon Tool Company at 4:30 p.m., which would have obviously made it impossible for him to have committed the crime. However, when investigators checked his time card, it revealed that William Schrader had checked out of work at 1:58 p.m., October 19th, 1962, and did not return to work until 5 days later, October 24th. So he is in the wind now for several days and has now told the investigators a lie that he was actually at the tool factory at the time of the murder. Obviously, police confronted him about the time card evidence. Schrader then changed his story. Instead, he said he had been installing a motor in his car at the Gross Junkyard in Bristol, and I remember where that was, October 22nd, the day of the murder. He said he was finishing the job on his motor, and then he finished it the next day on October 23. A state trooper investigating, checking out that story with James Gross, the owner of the particular junkyard. Gross could not recall if Schrader had been at his place that day. Which brings us now to the fourth suspect. In podcast 1, we told you that one of the suspects could have been a priest. The priest's name was the Reverend Joseph Sabatish. 3 other St. Mark's Parish priests had been interviewed by the Chief Faragalli and his men. All of the alibis of the 3 previous priests checked out, but Sabatish didn't. He said he had been visiting parishioners at the time of the murder, but when those parishioners were interviewed, they said he hadn't been there. Eyewitnesses told police that they had seen Sabatish on Mill Street, that's the town's commercial district, at about the same time of the murder. He was acting oddly on Mill Street, according to witnesses. The priest had gone into an establishment called Hopkins Shoe Store, where my mother had taken me many times to buy school shoes. In that store, Sabatish had asked the clerk for the time. The clerk told police he thought that was very odd. Sabatish was wearing a watch, and it had the correct time on it. Joseph Sabatish, the priest, had been a vagabond priest of sorts, having received several transfers by the Roman Catholic Archdiocese, bouncing around from parish to parish. He had spent time in a parish in upstate Pennsylvania. He had been transferred to St. Michael's the Archangel in nearby Levittown before he wound up at St. Mark's in Bristol. A parishioner told me that Sabatish had a, quote, eerie presence about him and an angry demeanor. And when he was questioned on this murder inside St. Mark's Church, Sabatish casually lit a cigarette. Cigarette smoke inside a church? The Bristol police officers thought that to be very odd and disrespectful. But there was yet another side to this wayward priest, a sexual side. Investigators looking into Sabatish found a receipt for women's lingerie from a shop in Humeville, PA, a town outside of Bensalem, a town approximately 5 miles from Bristol. The owner of the shop, her name was Dorothy Binder, told police that Sabatish was a regular customer and told her that he was purchasing the lingerie items for his wife. But that wasn't all. A woman named Betty Zabogalski of nearby Fairless Hills, PA, came out of the woodwork to provide police with more intriguing details. Zabogalski said that she had known Sabatish when he was part of the parish in upstate Pennsylvania. She said that Sabatish had recently renewed their acquaintance in Lower Bucks County once he found out that Betty had lived in Lower Bucks County. But that acquaintance, at first friendly, had turned sordid. Zabogalski said that Sabatish called her repeatedly at home and had made lewd sexual advances towards her. Zabogalski's husband tape recorded one of those calls and gave it to police. So, Vince, let's review. We have the drunken handyman wandering on the street who has confessed to the crime. We have the guy who had worked at the Croydon tool factory who had lied about his whereabouts that day, saying that he was at work when he really wasn't. We had a 19-year-old kid whose parents turned him into police because they thought something was fishy with the kid. Why would he have details of the murder? Why would he have written down Carol Ann Dougherty in a notepad? And finally, we have the priest with a very shaky background and sexual proclivities. Where do we go from here, Vince?
Wow, I mean, each one is incredible. The idea, parents are hardwired to protect their children. And so, which begs the question, like, did he come from an awful family where his parents wouldn't want to protect him? Or was he so troubled and that they believed deep in their hearts that he was capable of doing this heinous act to Carol Ann, that they would put him out there to the police and tell on him and make him a suspect in this crime? That one is kind of mind-blowing. I'm not a parent. You are. The idea that you would put up your kid as a suspect takes a lot, and so it makes me wonder what the motivation was.
Let's just remind people who may not have seen episode 1 on how this murder was actually discovered. Carol Ann Dougherty was returning a library book, innocently returning a library book with her bicycle with 2 of her friends down the way from the church on Ratcliffe Street at a place that was a small library at the time. It's since been rebuilt through donations from a foundation called Grundy Foundation, who was a very wealthy man, probably the wealthiest man that ever came out of Bristol, and donated a lot of his resources and his money to build a library. When they left the library, the 2 friends decided not to go to the church with Carol Ann, that they had to be home for supper. To this day, they regret that, and we'll find out more about their stories a little later on another episode of this podcast. Carol Ann Dougherty was conditioned by the nuns at her school, St. Mark's School, innocently, to say, if you pass a church, it would be a good idea to go in and say a prayer. Just connect with God any way you can. And so what she did that day on her way back from the library, on her way to her house for dinner, stopped in front of the church, parked her bicycle, went inside the church, and that's when her fate was decided. Now, when you look at this case overall, there obviously are priests inside that church. There obviously is a suspect now who lives on the street of that church, who may have seen her go into that church and had such psychotic DNA that he decided to commit a murder at that particular time. There was this strange 19-year-old kid who wrote her name in a book who was seen in Bristol by the postmaster. And finally, there was the drunken handyman who confessed to the crime. I can tell you now as we go into future areas of this podcast, the first suspect, the drunken handyman, was ruled out as deranged. The stories that he told weren't even close, and they reasoned that he could not possibly be a suspect, which leaves us now with three suspects as we go down the elements of this podcast. And in future podcasts, we will go deeper into what happened and how these suspects were interviewed and why they were able to wriggle out of any kind of probable cause to be arrested for this crime. Again, we talk about 1962, where DNA was not prevalent, where they tried to match hairs, a very inexact science, where they used really inefficient lie detector tests, which the suspects passed. At that point, where do you go? They were trapped, really, by the primitive nature of investigation in 1962. But as we look into this case, and we now have more information, and we will bring in DNA experts in this information. We will bring in concepts where you can now identify the killer through forensic genealogy DNA, where if you find relatives of the suspects and you can match whatever DNA you have left to the suspect's DNA, you may be able to find a killer. In addition, you may learn later in this podcast that there is some DNA that was not tested, that was held back, that was misidentified at the time, that they now can test. But this is all ahead on the podcast. The aim of this podcast is to get you thinking. We have now identified the four suspects. We have now got your mind thinking. We will add information as we go along. We want you to be involved in this case. And we hope that you're thinking right along with us on who this could have been. The easy answer is that this was a priest that committed this crime. But the answer is not always easy. And we will provide details later on that may indicate that, in fact, it was not the priest, or that it could have been the priest. Follow along. We are fascinated by this case. We are glad to bring you to this. And give you this has been a case that has been forgotten about. And I can tell you that from the things that we're doing right now, we have engaged law enforcement. Law enforcement is now involved in this situation, and they are working actively now that we've made this more of a talking point to actually find out who did this so a lot of people can rest easy. Vince, your thoughts?
I think that people are going to think they know what's happening, like I did as I started to learn about this case, only to discover that the farther you go down this rabbit hole, the more questions arise. And I think the questions are, in part, have naturally made it difficult. But I also think that the external forces that surround this case, whether, as you alluded to earlier, the Catholic Church, their ability to exert power and influence over a small papist community. I think that the farther we go along, I know we're going to learn more, but I think we're also going to raise a lot more questions.
And I think we're going to have a lot of answers to those questions. And that's the thing about doing an investigation, when you find a lot more information. And next week, we hope to have as our guest, J.D. Mullane. And he is, I owe a great deal of gratitude to J.D. As a columnist and a reporter for the Bucks County Courier-Times. He thought it was a good idea in 1992, on the 30th anniversary of this crime that's never been solved, to bring up the case again and to go over some facts and figures and to go over the politics that were involved in this, where the DA's office actually tried to reinvestigate it and they came up empty. Their strategy turned out to fail. So what we're doing now in the year 2024 is reviewing it maybe at a higher level where we can get the benefit of DNA and we can get the benefit of a lot of forensic experts. In fact, some of the people we're going to be talking to are members of a forensic society that meets in Philadelphia called the VDOC Society. They are a fascinating group of people who work on cold cases. And this was a case that they actually reviewed and were steered away from various political reasons. Until then, we hope you subscribe to the podcast. You can get it on YouTube. Tell your friends and neighbors. It's called The Coldest Murder. And you'll also be able to listen to the audio part of the podcast wherever you get your podcast. Again, it is The Coldest Murder. It is about the murder in 1962 of a young 9-year-old girl named Carol Ann Dougherty, who her family devastated her family, being murdered in a church. I can't think of a worse crime that was never solved. And we're going to try to do it. But thank you and keep listening. Good night, everybody.